This week we're going to be looking at how did the framers create the Constitution, lesson 11 through 14. Essential question, lesson 11. What questions do the framers consider in designing the three branches of the national government? Lesson 12. How did the delegates distribute power between national and state governments? Lesson 13. What was the Anti-Federalist position in the debate about ratification? And lesson 14. What were the Federalist position in the debate about ratification?
If they really understood Hamilton, they like Hamilton because they think it was for big government and central government and national.
Students will be able to, lesson 11, explain the role of each of the three branches and describe how the Constitution organized them. Also explain how and why the system of checks and balances contributes to limited government. Lesson 12, describe the major powers and limits on the national government, the powers that were specifically left to the states, and the prohibitions the Constitution placed on the state governments. Lesson 13, explain the role of Anti-Federalists in proposing a Bill of Rights and to identify their contributions and to identify other contributions their views had made towards interpreting the Constitution. Lesson 14, explain the key arguments of the Federalists and the process by which the Constitution was finally ratified. Here's our Florida standards. We're going to evaluate how the Constitution and its amendments reflected the political principles of rule of law, checks and balances, separation of powers, republicanism, democracy, and federalism. Evaluate the constitutional provisions establishing citizenship and assesses the criteria among citizens by birth and natural citizens and non-citizens. Evaluate, take and defend positions about the rights protected by the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. Explain why rights have limits and are not absolute. Examine the constitutional principles of representative government, limited government, consent of the governed, rule of law, and individual rights. Contrast how the Constitution safeguards and limits individual rights. Examine how power and responsibility are distributed, shared, and limited by the Constitution.
Despite the opposition research, despite Mueller's operations.
Here's our vocabulary: bill of attainder, ex post facto law, secede, supremacy clause, tariff, deliberative body, electoral college, enumerated powers, necessary and proper clause, faction, the Federalists, majority tyranny, anti-federalist, Bill of Rights, ratification, separated powers, and shared powers.
Ladies and gentlemen, they don't have anything.
Okay, so what did the delegates think about the balance of power? So, many Americans thought that an imbalance of power among different branches of government led to tyranny. Tyranny was on the minds of several of the founders because they all lived under a tyrannical government of the British king. So they believed that the British king, through bribes and favors, were able to control elections and exercise too much power over Parliament. So the framers are going to try to figure out ways to have a national government centralize a little bit of power, decentralize most power, but the main thing that was on their minds with both Federalists and Anti-Federalists was how do you prevent tyranny from taking place, because human nature, once they get into a powerful realm, human nature is going to take over and is going to abuse power. That's going to be true with anyone that they thought. Even George Washington thought that he could become himself a tyrant, and he wanted these checks and balances as well. So that's going to be a pivotal part when debating the Constitution that summer in Philadelphia, 1787. So the Constitutional Convention debated on how to create a system of government with balance of powers. So there's going to be checks and balances and a separation of powers between federal government and state governments through a system called federalism.
To serious danger of war with Great Britain. But not with France.
Okay, so what did the delegates think about legislative power? So Congress intended the Congress to be a deliberative body. So that's going to debate issues and avoid making hasty decisions. What we call a centralization of politics. We talked about in class this whole entire thing called an invitation to struggle. Okay, we're taking a look at the parliamentary system that they use in Europe versus here. So they wanted a decentralization of politics. They wanted government to be very slow and there'd be gridlock, just so that would prevent government from making hasty decisions. So the bicameral legislature of Congress made it difficult to pass laws because you have to get the same language in both the House of Representatives and the Senate before the president can approve of it. And if the president doesn't like it, he can still veto it. So the Virginia plan is going to give preliminary power, so this is unlimited and undefined. That's what James Madison is going to propose in the Virginia plan. But the New Jersey plan is going to have more strict powers. Why? Is because they didn't want a large federal government to abuse its power and impose that power on state governments. So some of these congressional powers is going to be enumerated powers. These are specifically stated in the Constitution, like assuming debts, raising a military, taxation, things of that nature. And they're also going to have a necessary and proper clause, otherwise known as an elastic clause. This is what we call implied powers. So Congress, under these implied powers in the necessary and proper clause, is that they can make laws for the times. Okay, so it doesn't really limit them per se, but they can create laws as times go on if it calls for us to take some swift action.
But the Republicans re-examined Washington's conduct as a whole. They rewrote their history.
So what about executive power? What did the delegates think about executive power? So the Articles of Confederation did not provide for an executive branch, so it was very hard for Congress to enforce any type of law at all. If they want to impose taxes, the individual states it'll be up to them if they want to pay it or not. Most of them didn't want to pay any type of federal tax at all. So there's going to be three key matters. Some founders believe that there should be more than one chief executive. Most believed it would be just one chief executive. So again, it goes back to that question of decentralization of power. If you have 7 or 8 quote-unquote presidents, and that was actually proposed, that would keep one particular president could keep the other 6 from abusing their power. But the problem about that is that, and this is where most believe that there should just be one chief executive, is because you might have a lot of infighting and then possible impeachments, and it's just a lot more drama than it really needs to be. You can put it this way too. Does it make sense to have 2 head coaches? Probably not. That's why every single team out there, if they want to be successful, will have one coach. That's the way to look at it as well. So our president, our coach, there's only one of them. And they're going to debate the length of terms. They are going to settle on 4-year terms. There were some delegates at the Constitutional Convention that proposed a 7-year term, but they wanted to make sure that these presidents could be evaluated every 4 years. The idea was called continuous elections or mini elections, things of that nature, just so that the people could reevaluate the president after every 4 years or so. But the big question is going to be eligibility of re-election. Has the president done enough? Has he not done enough? Is he abusing power? Things of that nature. So they on frequent elections of every 4 years.
To hold up what is good. Most colleges have lost their way. They're now in the grip of political correctness.
So how should presidents be selected? There were a couple who did believe in popular vote. In class, we're going to go over the Electoral College in great detail, just so that you know how it operates, because it is a little bit of a complicated system and it has been adapted over time. But let's just take a look at this slide. It says many fear that of the popular vote for president. Some did like that idea, but many did not. What some of the framers would call that is a tyranny of the majority. Many small states feared that direct election would give larger states more of an advantage. So one argument today about the Electoral College is the larger states, New York and California, would be determining every single election. And that's a pretty valid argument because there's more people in Los Angeles County, California than there are in 39, 40 states. Not combined, but if you take a look at Arizona, there is more people that live in LA County, California than the entire state of Arizona. So the big question is should you allow some states to basically control the destiny of a president, or should it be a process of all 50 states? Uh, Debating in letting Congress choose the president, there was thought about just letting Congress just choose the president. The problem was that Congress could manipulate the president and not keep the separation of powers. That's very similar to what the British system is. If in Great Britain, if the Prime Minister has a disagreement with Parliament, Parliament can call a no confidence vote and vote them out of office and elect a new Prime Minister that agrees with the legislature. The founders wanted to keep the two separate, just so that Congress could not manipulate the president in that way. And the election of the president will be done through the Electoral College. Okay, so again, we're going to go in great detail with this in class. So each state would select members of the Electoral College called electors. Each state would have the same number of electors as it had senators and representatives in Congress. So every single state gets 2 senators. Let's take Florida. Florida has 27 members in the House of Representatives. Well, 2 senators, Marco Rubio and now Governor Scott is now a senator. So Senator Scott now, and Senator Rubio, there's your 2 senators. You add 2 plus 27, you get 29. So during presidential elections in the Electoral College, Florida will send 29 electors. And we'll talk about in class the process on how those 29 are selected. Each elector would vote for 2 people, at least one of whom had to be a resident of a state other than the elector's state. The person who won the highest number of votes would become president. Second place would be vice president. This is actually going to be amended in the 11th Amendment, and we'll talk about that later. In a course of a tie, the House of Representatives state would have 1 vote, and that vote for president, and the Senate would vote for the vice president. This is still kind of true today. So if there's a tie in the Electoral College at 269 and 269, the House of Representatives would vote for the president, and the Senate would vote for the vice president. It's been done a couple times. It's been done in, I believe, the election of 1800, and again in the election of 1824, between Andrew Jackson and John C. Adams. But you could have a possibility of seeing it again, and you could have a president and a vice president of 2 different political parties. Right now, we're in divided government. If we have we're going to have a presidential election next year. Let's say President Trump doesn't get to 270, and it's a tie, 269 to 269. The House of Representatives is controlled by the Democrats right now. So the House of Representatives could vote for a Democratic president. The Senate's controlled by Republicans. The Senate could keep Mike Pence as vice president. That is a real possibility, even today.
To attempt to destroy the president, defeat him in re-election.
So what do the delegates think about judicial power? So judges should be independent of politics. Judges should hold office on good behavior. If it's not good behavior, then they can be impeached. And the courts were given the power to decide conflicts between state governments and to decide conflicts that involve the national government. We'll talk more about detail about the judicial power, but their main job was to interpret law at the national level and at the state level.
She's a radical ideologue, and the whole country could burn down, and it doesn't matter to her. Hers is a pursuit.
So, how are powers divided and shared among 3 branches? So, implementing their belief in the separation of powers, the framers limited the power of each branch as provided that they had certain shared powers. So, checks and balances is going to come into place here, and we'll talk more in detail about checks and balances this week. So, checks and balances was accomplished using several strategies, so the president could have the veto, even though the House of Representatives and the Senate would have to pass the same language, the president could still veto it. When it came to appointments, we're talking about appointments to the cabinet like Secretary of Defense, Secretary of Treasury, or ambassadorships, things of that nature. The president would appoint, but they would have to be confirmed by the Senate. Same thing goes with judges. The president will appoint judges, and then they have to be confirmed by the Senate. Treaties, the president would negotiate treaties, or the Secretary of State would, or who the president entrusted that power. George Washington, back in the 1790s, entrusted the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, John Jay, to create a treaty with the British. And after the treaty has been negotiated, it will be up to the Senate to ratify that. Going to war, the president is in charge of the military, but Congress has to declare war, so there's checks and balances there. Impeachment, if the president is charged with high crimes and misdemeanors, the House of Representatives will bring up articles of impeachment and investigate, and then the Senate will actually try the impeachment. So if the Senate decides to remove the president from office, that's what will happen. We've had two presidents, President Clinton and President Andrew Johnson, that have been impeached, but both were able to stay in power because they just did not get enough votes in the Senate. Also, judicial review. The judicial review is probably the most powerful power that the Supreme Court has. So if Congress passes a law and the president signs it, it's still up to the courts if they want to keep it or to shoot it down. That's going to be judicial review is going to be debated in the Philadelphia Convention, but it's not going to come to light until a court case in 1803 called Marbury versus Madison. So what powers did the national government have over state governments and the people? So there's just a whole list of articles here. So if we take a look at Article 1, Section 4, it's going to grant state legislatures the power to decide the times, place, and manner of holding elections for senators and representatives, but grants Congress the power to make or change regulations at any time. So Congress basically gets to set the dates, though, for national elections, but when it comes to states, states are in charge of voting. States get to decide how to set up precincts, what is needed at the voting precincts. Some states require ID, some of them don't. It's definitely up to the states. Article 1, Section 8 gives Congress the power to set a procedure for calling the militia into national service. That is definitely power that they have. States, even today, are National Guards. The National Guard is directly under the supervision of governors, but the president can call the National Guard into active duty. Article 4, Section 3 gives Congress the power to create new states. Article 4, Section 4 gives the national government the authority to guarantee to each state a Republican form of government. Article 4, Section 4 requires the national government to protect the states from invasion or domestic violence. So that means that when it comes to invasion, it's going to be up to the national government. The states do have right to state sovereignty and the right to protect their own borders. That is going to be debated in courts ever since the signing of the Constitution. But the national government does have the power to protect states from invasion. Article 4, Section 2, the Supremacy Clause, this is where the Constitution is going to be the supreme law of the land. So what limits did the delegates place on the national government? So the national government may not suspend the writ of habeas corpus. So this means a trial by jury, your due process. So they just can't snatch you up and throw you in jail. They actually have to deliver due process. No ex post facto laws or bill of attainder. So what ex post facto laws are, that means after the fact. So if you committed a crime that was deemed a crime today but wasn't a crime yesterday and you committed it, you can't be charged for that. That's what a ex post facto law is going to be. We're not going to suspend the right of trial by jury. You are entitled to that. Protections from the accusation of treason. and Congress cannot impose a religious test on people who hold a national office. There's a few senators just in the past couple of years who have come under hot water whenever they're in the confirmation process. Bernie Sanders actually did this last year. When they're confirming presidential appointees, they cannot discuss any type of religious tests at all. And some senators have actually tried to do it before and said, well, this guy's a Catholic, so I'm not going to vote for him, or this guy's a Jew, I'm not going to vote for him at all. That's actually unconstitutional, and that should not play a part at all when these senators are making decisions like that. It's right there in Article 4. Impeachment of the executive or judicial branches have protections and also in due process.
The agenda was that religious schools are inherently terrible. They are repressive.
So what limits did the delegates place on state governments? So, coining money, passing laws that enable persons to violate contracts, making ex post facto laws or bill of attainers, entering into treaties with foreign nations or declaring war. That's going to be a no-no. If Georgia gets into a treaty with Spain and Florida gets into a treaty with Great Britain, and both of them go to war against each other, then it's going to basically have a proxy war between Georgia and Florida. And the United States did not want that to happen. There's quite a few Federalist Papers on this subject. I believe Federalist 4 and Federalist 5 talk about that. Granting titles of nobility, laying duties on imports or exports, keeping troops or ships of war in times of peace, unfairly discriminating against citizens of other states, and refusing to return fugitives from justice to states from which they have fled. So if there's a fugitive that has escaped from Illinois and they're hiding out in Florida, and Florida catches them, they have to send them back. So what issues did the Philadelphia Convention leave unaddressed? Well, the issue of slavery is going to be a big one with the Three-Fifths Compromise. We're going to talk about Three-Fifths Compromise a little more in detail in class. But if you did not have the Three-Fifths Compromise, you did not have the United States of America. The southern states would have pulled out. So we're going to kick this can down the road for about 90 years, and we're going to solve it on a day called the American Civil War. It's going to be a pretty bad day in American history, but it is eventually going to be addressed. And also the issue of voting rights. This is going to be left as a state issue. You had some states that did allow women to vote, like New Jersey, and other states did not, and they could have their own requirements. Some states allowed basically anyone of the right age, aged 19, 20, 21 years old, that they could vote. And some states required land requirements. So that's going to be definitely left up to the states. So why was a ratification process required? So this goes back to the Articles of Confederation. So if you wanted to amend the Articles, and in this case in the Philadelphia Convention, we're just eventually just going to throw the whole thing in the trash. So amending the Articles of Confederation required approval by Congress and confirmation by the legislatures of 13 states. But what James Madison proposed for the ratification of the Constitution, for it to go into effect, we're going to have 9 out of 13 states. So another reason why the ratification process was required, it's because it's going to show an example of a new social contract with the whole entire country, and they are going to want the people to ratify the Constitution rather than the state legislature. That's why you see "we the people" in the Constitution. It's there for popular sovereignty reasons. Okay, we the people, popular sovereignty. So if the people agree with the Constitution, they're going to let their state representatives know and have the state legislatures ratify this Constitution.
Now, speaking of centralization of government control under secular government, it is amazing to watch as Democrats come out of the woodwork.
So, what were the key elements of the Anti-Federalist opposition? So, the Anti-Federalists had a huge fear of tyranny. So, they had a huge fear of centralization of power. If you have a centralization of power, then that means that the federal government is just going to trample over state governments, trample
No,
over
what?
people's rights. The human psyche is to gain power, and once that happens, you are going to abuse the population. So
Yeah.
they had a huge reservation, and rightly so, to be worried about this. So Anti-Federalist Robert Yates is going to argue in a series of papers called the Anti-Federalist Papers, called Brutus. His first one is going to be called Brutus 1. And he says that it can no longer reflect those citizens' character or wishes. Eventually, a powerful government would be so centralized that the government will always result to force and not the consent of the people. So some people are saying that we're seeing that right now. But again, you still have the decentralization of power in the Constitution. It's still there. Just because there is gridlock between the House of Representatives, the Senate, and the President. But this was a big fear by the Anti-Federalists because they believe that if you have a centralization of power, then tyranny is going to come along with it. So how did the Anti-Federalist philosophy shape their objections to the Constitution? So each branch of the government could have elements of tyranny. This was just the main fear of the Anti-Federalists. This is why they wanted to keep a confederacy and strong state governments. So the Constitution is going to give Congress authority to make its laws of what is necessary and proper. And this is going to be an argument against limitation of power because this elastic clause gives Congress the ability to make laws as necessary and proper for the time. Probably an extreme example is going to be in a case called Yamamoto versus the United States, and in that case, Yamamoto and many of these Japanese Americans are suing because Japanese Americans are being rounded up without due process and put into internment camps during World War II. And the United States Supreme Court is going to say that Congress had the right to do this because it's going to prevent espionage. So there's an example right there of a President FDR signing an executive order and using that power to put a bunch of people because of their possible allegiance to a foreign country during a time of war. The President also has unlimited power to grant pardons and could protect people he knows personally committed crimes. So if the President knows someone who has committed some type of crime, he can just pardon them. There is no limit on that. The Supreme Court could destroy the judicial branches of state governments. Checks and balances could be turned to take away people's individual liberties as well. So when we get the notion called the Bill of Rights, many of these founding fathers, these anti-federalists, were so adamant about putting that in there just so that the United States government would recognize these rights. And one of the reasons for the Second Amendment is to also prevent a tyrannical government from taking over. So if the federal government doesn't get too powerful, too centralized, too tyrannical, it's going to be up to the American people to protect themselves and to quote-unquote
probably 15.
Such government that is not securing their rights, as Thomas Jefferson said in the Declaration of Independence, and secure a new government that will recognize and protect those rights.
If God is in favor of something that God has not himself said he is in favor of, then you are taking his name in vain. You're perverting what is making it your own, and that's a real act.
All right, so should there be a Bill of Rights? So the lack of a Bill of Rights proved to be the Anti-Federalist's strongest and most powerful weapon. Many states did have those rights listed in their constitutions. The power of the national government are general and vague as to be almost unlimited. And again, it's going to go back to that necessary and proper clause, that elastic clause part of the Constitution. There is not a check and balance on the national government as a whole. That was another fear of the Anti-Federalists, and this is, again, where the Second Amendment is going to come into play, because that is going to be the last line of defense of check and balance to make sure that the federal government doesn't become too powerful. The first line of defense is going to be the states, and then it's going to be the individual citizens. So with that being in there, to be amended in the Constitution, that's going to settle a lot of these Anti-Federalist fears, and many of them are going to jump on board with the ratification of the Constitution.
They had all of these things before. You started tacking on top. Third way Nordic socialism. And there's a great book
So, what strategies did the Anti-Federalists use in the struggle for ratification? So, the Federalist Papers. That is going to be a huge argument that they're going to do. So, three men: Alexander Hamilton, John Jay from New York, actually both men are from New York, and James Madison from Virginia, are going to write a series of 85 articles, the ones we're reading about in class. These are going to be printed for the state of New York, but they're going to be distributed in all 13 states. And this is going to be used to convince the American people to influence state governments for ratification. And in the Federalist Papers, it's going to be everything from the House of Representatives, the judiciary, keeping civil war from happening. So the Federalist Papers are going to argue that the Constitution is going to reflect a new science of politics, and that's definitely true. The Constitution is the oldest working Constitution today. Most countries will start a new Constitution every 50 to 100 years or so, but ours have been inactive since 1788, 1789, and it just works.
A huge number of the patents, the majority of patents on planet Earth are coming from in the healthcare system.
So what are going to be the overall central arguments of the Federalists? So civic virtue can no longer be relied on as a sole support of a government that can protect people's rights and their welfare. Welfare, what that basically means is that it's their safety and happiness. Okay, that's what welfare means. Okay, they're able to promote their lives, try to better their situation. They're what Thomas Jefferson would call pursuit of happiness. The Constitution is going to organize the government, including the separation of powers and checks and balances, and the representation of different interests in the government will protect basic rights. So if the House of Representatives wants to take away property from one group and the Senate says no, it's like Justice Antonin Scalia said, it doesn't take much to throw a monkey wrench into the whole process. Because what this is going to do is that this is going to keep and protect the rights of the minority. Again, that invitation to struggle.
Okay, a couple more questions here. Brad says, "Hi Ben, I'm a working dairy father of one soon kid. I'd like to have more."
Okay, so how did the ratification process succeed? So eventually, 11 out of 13 states, minus North Carolina and Rhode Island, are going to ratify the Constitution. North Carolina is going to come around in 1790 after George Washington was president for over a year. That's eventually going to take place. And then Rhode Island is going to almost plunge themselves into their own little civil war because Rhode Island is going to be the last because their largest city, Providence, Rhode Island is going to threaten to secede. And after that whole entire threat, Rhode Island is going to be thrusted, whining and screaming to join the United States of America. So that's the process. That was the debate between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, and how we have the Constitution today.